Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to the Baker Institute. I'm very pleased tonight with our distinguished guest speaker, Georgiy Mamedov. He follows a line of Russian personalities that we've had at the Baker Institute. Some of you will remember we had President Gorbachev here way back in 1995 or 6. We've had President Putin. Here we've had our ambassador recently, Bill Burns, our ambassador to Moscow. And so it's really a pleasure for me to introduce to you Georgiy Mamedov. Truly, Georgiy is one of Russia's foremost authorities on the United States. It is scary how much he knows about our country. And this is something that I learned in my brief stint on Russian affairs when I was in the government and Soviet affairs at the time, and when we were assigned to Moscow. But I always felt that the Russian diplomats, the Soviet/Russian diplomats who were assigned to the United States or on the America desk were trained for many years. And their English was so much better than our Russian. Of course, I found that they did much more serious effort in language training, which is I'm hoping our Foreign Service will do also. But Georgiy has been really one of Russia's chief interlocutors with the United States on critical issues like NATO, arms control, and Kosovo. He has been involved in smoothing over some of the thorniest issues in U.S.-Russian relations and issues. For example, on NATO expansion, and then when President Yeltsin came into power and into office, and the Soviet coup attempt of 1991, Georgiy was there as a very important interlocutor for us on Ukraine and its nuclear weapons. He truly has been involved in some of the most serious issues involved in U.S.-Soviet and U.S.-Russian relations. He's a young man. He graduated in 1970 from Moscow State Institute of International Relations, a very prestigious institution. And then he joined another very important institution, the Institute for U.S. and Canada Studies, and became a protege of a mythic figure of those of us who were involved in Soviet and Russian affairs, Georgiy Arbatov, the leading Soviet specialist on the United States at the time. After he entered diplomatic service in the early 70s, he was posted to Washington, to the Soviet embassy in Washington, and for at least a couple of times to Washington. And then he became Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1991. And then in June of 2003, in his current capacity, he's the ambassador to Canada. A very good friend of mine, Sandy Vershbow, who was our ambassador to Moscow, describes Georgiy as a real problem solver, somebody who's always defended their interests quite aggressively and volubly, but he has been a good partner. Every U.S. ambassador who's dealt with him has found him to be a guy who could get things done. So please join me in greeting Georgiy Mamedov.
Thank you, Edward. I'm really dwarfed by your introduction. Of course, you shouldn't believe Edward. He's my old friend. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here. And forgive me, first of all, that I fooled you. I'm not a Russian. I'm Azeri. And every Azeri who comes from the Caucasus, whenever he's toasted, he must return the toast. And my return is quite obvious. It's to the great man, and I'm very proud to call him my friend, the man who actually founded this very important institution is Jim Baker. I spent 30 years, more than 30 years of my life dealing with the United States, and over the years I became acquainted with what Jim did for the United States, not only in dialogue with the Soviet Union and then with Russia, but also in terms of domestic politics. And when I currently learned that a very famous American got a Nobel Prize, it made me think that we have so many unsung heroes, like Jim Baker. We take many things that we face right now, like peace, for granted, though we were a step away from abyss, from a brink, and it were people like Baker who have foresight, who has plainly guts to take us away from it, to see in first in Soviets and then in the Russians not just, evil reincarnated, but partners, human beings with families, children, who also have certain, basic needs that can and should be accommodated through dialogue and not through confrontation. So my tribute is, of course, to Jim Baker, who is a major force, continues to be a major force in Russian-American relations, and I'm proud whenever we have a discussion with Jim over the phone, and I love to buzz him from Ottawa to Houston. It makes me feel, very nostalgic about my relations with Americans and American leaders. Whenever I call him, I try to pick his brains for things that are current to our relations, and I'm calling myself, with all due respect from our own diplomatic school, for my Russian and Soviet teachers, I call myself his junior partner in a big firm, the firm that for many years, unnoticed by onlookers, tried to keep very dangerous issues at bay and to find solutions rather than turn to spin doctors and, sound bites to analyze the relations and the future we have. So it makes me very proud to be here at the institute that Jim founded, and I hope in the future everybody who congregate here, people who work here like Edward and others, will continue to be an important factor in our relations. It makes me feel much safer, though I am now currently in Ottawa, and of course my priority are relations with Canada, but Canada is your neighbor, Canada are your friends and partners, and whatever we do with Canadians, we also try to keep in mind their neighbors to the south. And there are some interesting problems and joint ventures that we are now discussing that I hope will have very good positive spin-off for Russian-American relations as well. Of course, you understand, I'm not as presumptuous as to give you a lecture on international relations after the Cold War, because it would take more than one PhD, and certainly I'm not up to the task, so I will try to focus on some problems which I had to deal with. And since currently, at least judging from the press, we experience a period of certain frictions and problems and misunderstandings in our relations, I think it's important to look at how Cold War ended, what it really meant, and what underlying factors now influence our bilateral relations, and probably have a little glimpse about the future, though we don't have a crystal ball, and I'm fresh from the 8 hours flight from Ottawa, so probably my vision is a little distorted. And I don't want you to be confronted with smoke and mirrors. I will try to talk only about things that I know. For me, Cold War ended thanks to Jim Baker in 1991. And it was rather a schizophrenic ending, because if you remember, in fall 1991, Jim Baker, as the Secretary of State of the United States, was going to visit Moscow, and we actually had two leaders. One leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was just freed for his, arrest in the South, and the other leader, the rising leader of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. So, for a short period of time, for several months, we had a very interesting coexistence between Soviet Union, old Soviet Union, and new democratic Russia. Again, embodied, impersonated by Putin, by Yeltsin and Gorbachev. And it happened so that Minister of Foreign Affairs was in the eye of the storm. And of course, new guys who came with Boris Yeltsin wanted revolutionary purges, not unlike what Bolsheviks did in 1917, and to put all bureaucrats to the dustbin of history. But it was important to have normal, continuous dialogue with the United States, so it was decided that the same team that was dealing with the United States and the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs would do the same for Yeltsin. Yeltsin made a personal decision, and your humble servant was carrying for several months two hats. And we even had an arrangement with your chargé d'affaires, Mr. Collins, at the time, that before lunchtime, I will represent old totalitarian Soviet Union, and after the lunchtime, I will represent new democratic Russia. Sometimes it got mixed, but generally we survived. But I'm telling about the Cold War, not about my relations with Jim Collins. And we had to prepare talking points, like all bureaucrats do, when Jim Baker was arriving. And so we had to prepare talking points both for Yeltsin and for Gorbachev to talk, to have discussions with Jim Baker. And what struck me when we were in the process of preparation, in talking points for the Soviet Union, for the Secretary General of the Communist Party and President of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and in talking points for Boris Yeltsin, we supported arms control, we supported Desert Storm, we supported cooperation with Americans on Middle East, on economy and other things. There's only one difference. One page, or basically 2 pages. It was, I remember, 2 pages. It was analysis of domestic situation in my country. So I had my most talented guy on my staff to write this one, because I was afraid that he will certainly, go crazy. Because in the talking points for Yeltsin, he criticized Gorbachev for being a totalitarian leader and so. And in talking points for Gorbachev, he criticized Yeltsin for being adventurous and so on and so forth. I still have these talking points in my personal archive. And then it dawned on me that if both the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the leader of New Democratic Russia want to cooperate with the United States, the Cold War is over. Because there is no embedded opposition that would like to turn it back. And of course it was all performed up to the script, and if you ask Jim Baker, if you have an opportunity, ask him about this historic visit to Russia-Soviet Union in the fall 1991, and he will tell you how successful it was. Since then, we had major achievements, and I remember standing together with Boris Yeltsin, and Edward mentioned it, during the joint session of your Congress, and listening to thunderous standing ovation to the line that Boris Yeltsin said. And the line was very simple: I killed communism. So it was received, of course, with great enthusiasm, though I must mention, because certainly you will ask me about Putin, why he's so tough, is he a throwback to KGB times, and so on. And I know Vladimir Putin quite well and worked with him before he became president of Russia, so I am quite prepared to talk with you about that. But justice must be done. The communism actually diminished its influence under Putin, because during Yeltsin in 1996, during elections of 1996, communists were still the favorites, and they could have taken the power back, because we didn't have a civil war. We didn't have royalists running to Canada or anything. Everybody remained where they were. So it wasn't a matter of using, tanks or machine guns. It was turning the psychology of the population around, because for 70 years, all of us were convinced that there can be only one country in this country, communists. It was, their way or highway. Quite simple. And so in 1996, communists nearly had power snatched back from Yeltsin. And in 1999, the year when he gave up his power and passed it over to Putin, he was nearly impeached. I know you know everything about your impeachment processes. You love, reading about them, and whenever I visited the United States and met with your leaders, it was also a subject for speculation, because it influenced foreign policy to a certain extent. I mean, the domestic policy always does. But I bet not many of you knows that in 1999, Yeltsin was nearly impeached by Russian parliament, and 67%, almost 70, it's a huge number, of Russian people were in favor of putting him on trial for genocide against his own people. That was the official title. So now, if you look at current situation in Russia, communists would be lucky if they get 7%, if they simply make the parliament. And not because they are thrown in jails or anything is happening to them. Simply, it's a matter of the past. We've turned the corner, and people are starting to believe that though market economy is not a free lunch, freedom associated with market economy can give you more than authoritarian, totalitarian past. So what actually transpired recently, and due to certain economic changes inside Russia. And we won't be able to understand certain things in our bilateral relations, and we won't be able to make an enlightened guess about future if we don't take into account domestic situation. What was important in Russia in 1991? And before being stationed, posted to Canada, I spent 20 years in Moscow. Not in Paris, not in London, not in Rome, in Moscow. So I know a little bit about, or probably even more, about what happened in Russia than what happened in the United States or in Germany or somewhere else. And everybody is criticizing Putin today when he said that collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy. He misspoke. What he meant, it was a natural calamity. It doesn't mean that he regrets Soviet Union, because he's on the record saying that Stalin was a tyrant, that people were sent to prison. My own granddad was shot by Stalin. So there is no love lost between people who were dealing with the United States after 9/11 and Stalinist past. What he meant, it was a great natural calamity. We gained freedom, but people, ordinary people in the street, simultaneously lost free education, free Medicare, affordable housing, guaranteed pensions. I don't know about United States. Probably people here have a lot of stamina and they can survive it easily. But in my favorite Canada, if anybody during the upcoming elections, be it liberals or conservative, will just mention that they must have not, totally commercial Medicare, but at least, piece of it being commercial. Believe me, this guy will be committed to the dustbin of history in no time whatsoever. And Russian people, ordinary people, not ideologues, not, people who used to ride in limousines of the Communist Party, they lost everything. And while Russian people, during their very tough and tragic history, were used to wait for better future to come, and they were sold on many foreign models, like, for example, I remember when I was political director for Russia in G8, we once had a clash with my friend from Germany. And he said, Georgiy, promise all of us, the G7, that never again imperialism, Russian imperialism, will rear its ugly head. I said, Wolfgang, I can commit myself in blood any moment in paper under one condition, quid pro quo. Promise me that never again Marxism will come from German soil. Because we suffered for 70 years for the foolhardy theory that you gentlemen sold us on. Even without speaking, about the organizational capacity and so on. So people waited, and early 90s, of course, weren't the exciting time for low-paid people to live in Russia. Now, situation is starting to change for the better. Yes, part of it is due to high energy prices, to oil and gas. In this respect, we're like Canada, their loonie is going up. We lost 30% of our salary working in the Russian embassy in Ottawa because of the change of currencies. This is life. This is life, and you have to pay for economic changes. But it isn't only that. It's also the importance that people see Putin attaches to reestablishing social safety net on new market foundation. And they don't care that much about foreign policy. Unfortunately, probably. But this is what they want. They want the basics. They want basic free child care, like I said, free education, and so on and so on. I can enumerate that. And frankly speaking, at the beginning, in early 90s, after all this thunderous applause from your Congress, from other parliaments, they expected some help. Well, since it wasn't yet a foregone conclusion that communists were thrown out of power, I told you about that. The litmus test was whether market economy will bring easier life for people and continue to guarantee certain social services. And one of the mistakes, I believe, that West made in general, and Americans in particular, that this help wasn't coming at all. People were waiting for something like Marshall Plan, because they believed that 70 years of totalitarian regime can be compared. I don't want, to tell about all the terrible things of Stalin's years and so on, but in terms of loss of human lives and everything, it certainly can be compared to a very major military conflict. Certainly it makes Iraq pale, Vietnam pale, and so on and so forth. So people were expecting that since now we are not only defeated, officially communism, but are trying to do it practically so it never comes back, there will be some help forthcoming. This is what I was trying to do in my discussions with your President, Secretary of State, with other foreign leaders within G8 and so forth. And once there was a glimmer of hope, in very hush-hush discussions, we were promised not much, but still something, alleviation of our outstanding Soviet debt to the West. Parameters were something like $20 billion, that there will be $20 billion write-off. For comparison, and you can check with Edward, you know what we recently did to Iraq, to some other countries, including Russia, in writing off their debts. So there was a promise. But then, and there wasn't, at this time, any major international tensions, and nobody was discussing new edition of Cold War, and we were all friends, and we were, globetrotting between different Western capitals, including Ottawa and Washington, signing peace treaties and declarations of eternal love and friendship and everything. So it all looked very encouraging. But then suddenly signals started to come from the West that leaders didn't feel comfortable with their own promise. And I must tell you, it was a turning point in the psychology of generation of certain of our policymakers in Moscow, who dealt with the West, were trying to convince that now we entered the new, age, and everything will be different, and look at this $20 billion, it's the first installment, in strategic partnership. And then suddenly our leaders came back to us, to bureaucrats, and said, you promised us that, and you told us that it was as good as said, and we're hearing different story. That it may be a joint international effort to confront non-proliferation, but no discussion about write-off. And it isn't the only example that I can give that made life a little more difficult. Though probably in the final analysis, it's better to rely on your own opportunities and to try and to mobilize your own internal resources. But it shows a certain, unpredictability in approach of some major Western countries vis-à-vis Russia at a crucial period where our foreign policy, basic tenets of our foreign policy vis-à-vis the West were actually formulated. But like I said, now we turned the corner. Our economy is doing quite well. I won't again bother you with the numbers. We are doing better than anybody in G8. Important thing now is to translate it all in working and effective socio-economic programs. But if we want Cold War to be delegated just to the memory and to be able to tell our ordinary people, not, highbrows from think tanks, but men in the street, that new relationship matters, we need also to be able to show economic effects of the new relationship. Because, like I said, our people, they may have lived through different history, more dramatic. Yeah, we didn't have, such a tutoring in democratic rights and free speech and so on. But they're still human beings with their families, children, and so on. And it's bread and butter that concerns them. I understand today Putin was having some kind of internet dialogue with Russian population, and the number one issue is why prices increased recently, different, things about unemployment, education. This is what bothers people. So if we want to make foreign policy relevant and relations relevant to large masses of people and not to just, closed elite, it must also have economic underpinning. That's why I remember with your current president, we had very interesting discussions whether government should support business dialogue. Because American theology always was that business will trailblaze anywhere. You don't need to encourage business, will do what it needs. Our arguments were, and it was 2001, that we don't have yet the kind of business that you already have after 300 years. Our business is different. Sometimes it's Al Capone business, So if we need to have a civilizing effect, if we need to teach our business social responsibility, it must be involved in greater scheme of things. So if we are discussing cutting strategic arms in Middle East, it's also high time to discuss how governments can support business engagement. Because many young people in Russia today don't go to, like we used to believe it's very prestigious to become a diplomat. Because other than being a diplomat, there was no way that you can bypass an iron curtain. Today, if you have money, if you work in oil business or, selling cars in Moscow or St. Petersburg, you will have much more opportunities to travel abroad than us diplomats do. It's as simple as that. The equation changed, which means that young generation of Russians are more influenced not by stories in newspapers about what happened, in North Korea or somewhere else, but about business exploits and business projects. And if we can work business projects into the fabric of our relationship, it will mean that there will be a guarantee that we won't ever try to use tension to gain something to further our national interests. We will never have a Cold War again. And it's not simply because I lived through Cold War. I was an ultimate Cold Warrior. Last time we prepared for the hot war with the United States without your even knowing it was 1983. When I say without you knowing it, I mean without you sitting here knowing it. because your military also prepared, I mean, to attack us with nuclear weapons using strategic maneuvers in 1983. But who remembers that? That's a fine quality of human mind. We shut it off. We take everything that we achieved for granted. But this was possible only when we were blinded by certain ideological ambitions and crusading mode. With all due respect for the United States, there is now only one crusading power, United States. You do it in space, both for yourselves and for us. We are much more introvert, because like I told you, for us the problem is to show people that what they suffered for and what transpired, all these collapses, are worth it. And of course it will be a prerequisite for freedom and everything else, and a guarantee against authoritarian flashbacks. In the United States, there is a certain revolutionary spirit. At least I detected it in early 2001, 2002. I always played, Edward knows, devil's advocate. So whenever the case was brought between our presidents that, you know, there are some sinister things on the American minds, that they want to encircle us, that they feel they won the war, you know, and we are the losers, and now we will be molded. I always said, you know, no, that's not the case. They are the same people as we are. I mean, 2 hands, 2 legs, you know, families, children. Let's look what's driving them. And one of the important things that had a traumatic effect was 9/11. No denying that. It was a great shock to the United States. And I'm very proud to say that President Putin took advice of Minister of Foreign Affairs and not some other advices, and was the first leader to call George Bush on 9/11 and said, we'll give you everything. We'll give you bases in our south. I will talk to the former to new leaders of newly independent states, because we are with you, not only because of Chechnya. We have 16 million Muslims in Russia, and we understand what it is all about. Probably not today, but tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, what may happen. And we are not alone in this boat. Look at my Canadian friends. They also have, though they have 800,000 Muslims, but when I asked their friends working in law enforcement, and now we have a very tight relationship, unlike Cold War. This is another difference from the Cold War. This is what they are concerned about, homegrown terrorism, not the terrorism that will come, you know, flying from abroad, but second generation terrorism, all this, you know, the extremists using mosques and other opportunities, podiums here. So this was a huge traumatic effect on American psycho. And reasoning was, we won't wait again for this to happen to us. We'll bring the fight to them. And that's why even liberal press in the United States, now they are involved in Monday morning quarterbacking. But, you know, at the time, even the liberal press said, yes, sure, I mean, there are weapons of mass destruction, let's go into Iraq, though always the basic, it wasn't oil. I don't agree with with Mr. Greenspan. He's a huge specialist on economy and everything, but I don't agree that it was about oil. I think it was a reaction, never again. And if part of it is a regime change, be it a regime change, wherever. And it put you on a very, of course, thin ice. We lived on this thin ice ourselves, because Russia is like Canada. We have oil, gas, huge country, and so on, but we live in a miserable neighborhood. All the countries that you believe are the basic threat to you are bordering on us. So we can't afford ourselves, such, drastic surgical moves. We have to be, in our foreign policy in general, more therapeutic. I remember when I bid farewell to your president on the eve of invasion of Iraq. And since I happened to know him before he became president, we had a discussion, and he had negotiations with Putin. Before that, Putin, in unprecedented fashion, put on the table some of our intelligence information about Iraq, what was there and what wasn't there. And there were people at the table who were prepared, to vouch for it, because we had a long relationship with Iraq, even before Desert Storm. And our military knew about their capability, weapons of mass destruction, others. Of course, they weren't sharing the knowledge because of Cold War. But now the Cold War was over, and we were so afraid that you will walk into this trap, because we were living in this neighborhood. And whatever the commotion will be created will engulf us with all our fragility in early 90s, with all our lack of social stability, with transparent borders, because we have fallen apart, and all these independent states in Central Asia were patently incapable of taking care of their security. Now NATO is, criticizing each other, who is doing more in Kandahar, who is doing more in Kabul. Germans don't want to go to the north. Dutch don't want to go to the east. And before 9/11, we alone were facing Taliban. That was created by CIA to fight Soviet Union. If you don't believe me, read memoirs of my good friend George Tenet, former director of your Central Intelligence. And you'll see it in a very, compact form. What was in Afghanistan during the Cold War, what happened afterwards. It's quite a telling book. So we did our best to try to keep you out. And what I heard from your leadership was, you Russians are traumatized by 1991. Because your nationhood collapsed, your ideology collapsed, you lost everything, and so on. So you're a bit yellow. And we Americans are quite prepared to be strong and to take this burden off everybody's shoulders. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out so easy and pretty. But like I said, the easiest way would be to gloat. During the Cold War, I would be the first to read position papers, what we should do to use Iraq, to drive a wedge between Canada and the United States, between France and the United States. Now it's a different world. And one of the problems in the aftermath of the Cold War is nobody expected the new international agenda. Nobody. I don't know anybody in Russia or in France or in United States who knew that terrorism, that regional conflicts, that depletion of resources, lack of water, AIDS will make the number one priority and not nuclear weapons. We weren't prepared for that. And of course, like with economic relations, some urgent measures were needed, like changing international organizations, changing even legal norms and agreements. Well, we did certainly, again, thanks to Jim Baker, we changed the basic underpinning of our strategic relationship, START treaties. We brought in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Russia. It was very hard to convince them to get rid of nuclear weapons. Ukrainians are still smarting. Though I don't know why, because I don't think they have the capability to take care of them. But it was thanks to Americans, to your participation. It wasn't Russian imperialists. It was American France who put the squeeze on Ukrainians to give up nuclear weapons. And the same is true about other arms control treaties. For example, this famous treaty of troops in Europe that is now being discussed because we don't like the fact that it's still based on the existence of non-existent Warsaw Pact. But again, I won't bother you with all these problems. The fact is we changed agreements, but we didn't change the organizations and psychology. And that's why when it was announced that NATO will enlarge, it was a shock. Like the fact that you won't write off $20 billion for us, though you promised. And again, it gave a raise to all these people who were, committed to shadows, but who didn't disappear, who made their careers and their livelihood during the Cold War, and they were in the front again. And the major deterrence wasn't between us and you. It was between common sense people inside us and ideological guys. And the same was true here and continues to be true. So I'm always very grateful to Jim Baker, to Edward, when they invite us for serious discussions here, because I believe that the future, whether we will be able forever to close the door on any discussions of Cold War, to cooperate on Iran and other things in full, not, piecemeal, depends on whether the common sense people in our leadership and your leadership will get together and be so mutually reinforcing as Lunatic Fringe sometimes is. Because whenever you read in American newspaper that say there is a new strategy that will again target Russia and China with nuclear weapons, immediately you can expect during the next meeting with the president, when military and foreign affairs and other people, that there will be somebody raising and saying, Mr. President, they're going to attack us again. So let's, put this hard-earned oil and gas money not in child care, but a new missile with 12 warheads. We went through it before. Those of us who know will continue, to try and deter it. But like I said, we must be mutually reinforcing. We shouldn't be guided by the headlines. And what's more important, we must create what Henry Kissinger used to call inbuilt interests. They're economic, and they're also between ordinary people, especially young generation. I am concerned about young generation. I am not as concerned about this, pseudo Cold War chess games, because I know how they can be played and what will be the result. But I am concerned about the poisoning effect that all these discussions, that we are enemies again, that Russians will never be good. They're committed to be our enemies, they're totalitarian, everything is going to the dogs in Russia, how it will poison not only your youth, but also our youth, because there's always a response. There's always a response. I come from academic community, and I hope soon I will be back to academic community after I retire, and I hope I will try to explain to my young generation that all the stereotypes that exist right now, whether about Russia or United States, are very harmful, and they must find for themselves now that there's every opportunity to travel, to read everything you want, to go everywhere you want, to start joint ventures. In Canada, for example, we discussed it with Edward, we are now launching a huge trilateral project in energy that would have both us, Canadians, and hopefully Americans involved. And I know that Jim Baker and other people who stand by him, also influential people, understand that this has not only economic effect. It's not only about prices at the gas pump. It's also about the climate in which our relations after the Cold War will develop. So, like I said, I don't see any crisis in our relations. I see problems because we overlooked certain things. We took certain things for granted. we discussed on our way from airport that even tree won't grow if you don't water it every day. And when the air is polluted, I mean, everything really can turn yellow and rotten. So the only answer is engagement. And believe me that the new generation of Russian people who will deal with new generation of Americans have every interest in making the relationship work. And I know personally Putin, so I'm not talking about something I don't know. I know that he realizes that our relations with the United States are one of the most important relationships in the world. That's why we try to make the most of his personal relationship with George Bush, though we understand that not everybody here is an avid fan of George Bush, but, this is what we have. This is what we must build on. If there will be others, I mean, I hope, knowing Bill Clinton a little bit, who I know was committed to improvement of our relations and continues to be committed, though the atmosphere of election campaign makes such statements now not very popular. So whoever makes, the leadership in the United States or Russia, I am absolutely certain they will be under pressure of our new elites and under pressure of people in the street, if people in the street have all the necessary explanation, to work for partnership and cooperation and resolve the problems that we all face, like terrorism, proliferation, economy, social things, immigration, what's not, through encouraging partnership and not through building new walls. I'm absolutely certain that there will be competition as well. I don't know whether you have any football fans here. I was crushed by the way that my favorite Dallas Cowboys played against New England Patriots last week, and it's not because of cheerleaders, but since 1970 I'm really a Cowboy fan, and there will be a competition, and the results will be different, the fight for markets and everything else, but the basic tenet of our relation, that they are most important, and that without our cooperation, all these challenges that all civilized world face now have very feeble chances to be met adequately. I am completely certain. And from my humble position in Canada, I will try to watch over you and hail all your successes. And whenever you feel like that, though the change of currency doesn't make that very, exciting proposition, come and shop in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. You've seen why he has been such an effective interlocutor between our two countries and now with Canada. We only have time for a couple of questions. I know you probably have hundreds of questions, so please, if you can...
Actually, what is the situation with fresh drinking water in Russia, and who are the competitors for that supply?
First of all, as you know, we treat now this uranium issue as a big issue of non-proliferation. We just signed an agreement with Americans. We have a special initiative. And we proposed, and I expect your administration will propose soon, to build international centers which will localize all the supplies of not only this uranium water, and also fissile materials, and will bring them under very effective international cooperation. Secondly, we are also now trying to involve former republics of the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan, in this international cooperation. As in general, about the future, we just proclaimed very recently, some G8 countries don't agree with us, that without growth in nuclear energy sector, we won't be able to continue effective economic development. So we are going to build a lot of new nuclear blocks in Russia. So whatever we have now, I think it will be mostly consumed by ourselves. And I understand that one of the concerns is about proliferation of what is inside Russia. But I think, A, it will be consumed by our own potential and our plans, and B, that we will be involved together with Americans in very effective international transparent programs under International Atomic Energy Agency control that would localize all the negative potential of this issue.
There's so many, okay. One, you had your hand up, and then Judy, and then... Please make it short. Please make your question.
I used to spy on you guys back in the 70s, and I almost got shot down by the Russians one time. And I know what you can know and what you can't, as far as security goes. You said something that y'all talked to Bush about weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Did you tell him that Iraq had them or not?
We told him that he didn't have. I mean, that Saddam Hussein didn't have. Of course, we sounded the caution. We said, to the best of our knowledge, like intelligence work. He said, since you spied on us, you must know.
We were a little more like we really know or we don't.
So we said, to the best of our knowledge, they don't have nuclear weapons. So there is no need to walk in. Let's continue strangulating them through sanctions of the United Nations. That's what's our...
And I'm glad you didn't kill me.
Your Excellency, a brief question. You mentioned that the 20 billion write-off was a turning point in the psychology of Russian diplomatic leadership. Could you give a more precise chronology?
What's diplomatic leadership? Our diplomatic leadership, I can enumerate all the foreign ministers. They all fight like hell, playing your advocates, believe me. Some were more obnoxious, like, Kozyrev, others like Lavrov and Ivanov, they are much more balanced. But I never remember a case when a Minister of Foreign Affairs would try to suggest something to his leader that would detrimentally affect relations with the United States. So they are all, or used to be and are, all advocates, but of course within this framework they have to look after their national interest as well, because it's not a charity thing. But when I said about 20 billion, it didn't affect diplomatic stuff, it affected leadership. Because it was promised to leaders, by leaders to leaders, and not by one leader to one person, but by several to one. And then nothing happened.
Judy, you're going to have the last question.
Why is Putin not clearly articulating that for Iran to build up to the ability to have nuclear explosives, or whatever the term is not bad? He seems to be so equivocal in actually fighting the U.S. in this position. I would think it would be to your interest to put economic sanctions on Iran as well as it is for our interest.
Like I said, we're living in the neighborhood, and this is the difference between us and you. We are containing our neighbors by combination of diplomatic, military, political, and economic means. And sometimes containment means also extension of economic ties. Ask Edward, who is a leading specialist in American political science. Ask him about the article by Mr. X, by George Kemp, the founding father of the School of Specialists. And you remember his article about Soviet Union? And it was in at the time when there was a drop shot plan by Americans to bomb us with nuclear weapons. So it was terrible time, awful time. And he was an ambassador to Moscow, so he was a responsible guy. And he published an article in which he said that we must contain Soviet Union, but not by attacking him, but by extending economic ties. So this is what we're doing with Iran.
Thank you very much.
Same logic.
This is a little souvenir of the bakery.
Thank you. And in return, to show you that, Russian bear is changing, we are prepared to use Canadian uniform.
We've never got a gift like this.